My daughter-in-law looked
You
directly at me
always
in front
manage
of
to
12
disappoint
guests
everyone,
and
Mother.
said,
This
"Some
dinner is
people
just
spend their
another
whole
example of your
lives
failure."
accomplishing absolutely nothing." Everyone knew she meant me. I sat quietly at the end of the table wearing the same blue dress I had owned for years while my son avoided my eyes. Vanessa
I
believed I
didn't
was
know
just
about
an old
this.
widow with no money, no education, and no story worth telling. Then she opened the small box of photographs I had brought.
This cannot be
The room
true.
became silent. Her face turned pale when she recognized the people standing beside me in those pictures, and one of them belonged to her own family. That was the moment my daughter-in-law realized she had spent 3 years insulting a woman she never truly knew. If my story touches you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been judged by someone who didn't know your story? And wherever you're watching from tonight, please share your city and the current time there. Sometimes, knowing we're not alone makes these stories feel a little closer to home. My name is Daniela Perry, and for most of my life, I believed that if you loved your family enough, they would eventually see your heart. At 67 years old, I lived alone in a small brick house on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. The house wasn't beautiful by modern standards. The paint on the porch needed touching up, the kitchen cabinets were older than my son, and the floors creaked every winter. But every inch of that house carried memories. My husband, Robert, had built the wooden shelves in the living room with his own hands. The oak tree in the backyard had been planted the day our son Ethan was born. The faded wallpaper in the hallway had survived 3 decades because Robert once told me it made our house feel warm. Robert had been gone for 11 years. Cancer took him much faster than either of us expected. One moment, we were discussing retirement plans and road trips through New England, and 6 months later, I was standing beside his hospital bed holding his hand as he took his final breath. After he died, the house became very quiet. Too quiet. For a long time, Ethan was the reason I kept moving forward. He had always been a gentle boy. Even as a child, he hated seeing anyone sad. When his father became sick, Ethan drove home from college every weekend. He sat beside Robert for hours, helping him eat, reading the newspaper aloud, pretending everything would somehow return to normal. After Robert passed away, Ethan became protective of me. He called every evening. He visited almost every weekend. He fixed things around the house and made sure I wasn't spending holidays alone. For several years, I believed my son and I would always remain close. Then he met Vanessa Collins. I still remember the first time Ethan brought her to my house. She was beautiful, tall, elegant, perfectly dressed. Her blonde hair looked as though it belonged in a magazine, and her smile was carefully practiced. She carried an expensive handbag, wore jewelry that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment years earlier, and spoke with a confidence I had never possessed. When Ethan introduced her, he looked happier than I had seen him in years. "Mom, this is Vanessa." She shook my hand politely. "It's so nice to meet you." Her words were warm. Her eyes were not. I noticed it immediately. Women my age notice things younger people often miss. She looked around my living room before she sat down. Her gaze moved across the old furniture, the photographs, the worn carpet, the antique clock. She smiled politely, but I could see the judgment hiding behind her eyes. That afternoon, I prepared the meal myself. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, homemade rolls, apple pie. The same recipes my husband loved. The same recipes Ethan had grown up eating. Vanessa took a small bite. "Oh," she said, "this is very traditional." I smiled. "My mother taught me." She nodded. "We usually eat much lighter meals." I remember Ethan quickly changing the subject. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. After all, every family takes time to adjust. When Ethan announced their engagement 6 months later, I was genuinely happy. I helped organize the bridal shower. I contributed money toward the wedding, even though my savings were limited. I spent weeks sewing table decorations because Vanessa wanted something elegant but custom made. I wanted her to feel welcomed. I wanted her to know she already had another mother. The wedding itself was beautiful. It took place at a vineyard outside Cincinnati. Everything looked expensive. Crystal lights, white roses, string musicians, professional photographers. As I sat among Vanessa's family, I noticed how different our worlds were. Her father, Richard Collins, owned several investment properties. Her mother, Margaret, belonged to multiple charitable organizations. Their friends discussed international travel, private schools, and country clubs. Meanwhile, I had spent most of my life working as a school secretary. I had balanced household budgets, clipped coupons, worked extra hours, saved every dollar I could. For the first time in many years, I felt self-conscious. Still, I told myself none of that mattered. Ethan loved her. That was enough. Or at least, I thought it was. After the wedding, Ethan and Vanessa purchased a large home in a wealthy suburb north of Columbus. The house had high ceilings, a marble kitchen, and more bathrooms than my entire house had rooms. The first time I visited, I brought a homemade casserole. Vanessa accepted it politely. Later, I found it untouched in the refrigerator. Small things began happening. She corrected the way I set the table. She replaced my flowers with flowers she preferred. She laughed gently when I struggled with certain technology. Once, while helping prepare dinner, I overheard her speaking quietly to a friend. "Ethan's mother is sweet," she said. "She's just very old-fashioned." I tried not to take it personally. Everyone uses that phrase now. Old-fashioned. As if kindness becomes outdated. As if loyalty expires. As if sacrifice belongs to another century. Ethan didn't seem to notice these things. Or perhaps he chose not to. Whenever I mentioned feeling uncomfortable, he would smile. "Vanessa doesn't mean anything by it, Mom. She's just different. Don't be so sensitive." Those words hurt more than Vanessa's comments. Because they came from my son. The boy I had raised. The boy I had protected. The boy whose nightmares I once chased away. Months became years. Visits became less frequent. Phone calls became shorter. Sometimes Ethan canceled dinner because Vanessa had other plans. Sometimes holidays changed. New traditions, new guest lists, new priorities. I found myself sitting alone in my quiet house more often. One rainy afternoon, I stood in my kitchen making soup for myself. The television played softly in the background. Outside, leaves covered the yard. The clock Robert built ticked steadily. And suddenly, I realized something painful. I was becoming a guest in my own family. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was afraid. Afraid that age makes people invisible. Afraid that once your children build new lives, your own story stops mattering. Afraid that everything you sacrificed can slowly disappear without anyone noticing. Still, whenever Ethan called, I answered. Whenever they invited me, I came. Whenever Vanessa needed help, I offered it. Because mothers continue loving long after they stop feeling loved themselves. I had no idea then that my daughter-in-law had already decided exactly who she believed I was. An ordinary widow, a retired secretary, a woman with old clothes, an old house, and an old life. Someone who had accomplished nothing. Someone who was nobody. And perhaps the most painful part was that my own son had started believing it too. The first year of Ethan and Vanessa's marriage taught me something I had never fully understood before. Disrespect rarely arrives all at once. It enters quietly. It begins with small comments, little corrections, gentle smiles that hide sharp edges. By the time you realize you are being diminished, part of your confidence has already disappeared. At first, I continued visiting Ethan and Vanessa every Sunday. Those dinners had been our tradition long before Ethan married. When he was young, Sundays meant roast chicken football on television and long conversations around the kitchen table. I assumed those traditions would continue. I was wrong. Vanessa had her own ideas about family. Her dining room looked as if it belonged in a magazine. Every plate matched perfectly. Every napkin was folded precisely. Candles sat exactly in the center of the table. Everything had rules. Everything had standards. And somehow I always seemed to violate them. One Sunday, I arrived wearing a soft green cardigan Robert had bought me years earlier. Vanessa looked me up and down. "Oh," she said. "You still wear those sweaters?" I smiled. "This one belonged to my husband." She nodded politely. "It's very vintage." The word sounded kind, but it wasn't. Another evening, I brought homemade peach cobbler. Ethan had loved it since he was 8 years old. Vanessa placed it on the kitchen counter. "We've been trying to avoid sugar lately," she said. Later that night, I saw the untouched dish sitting beside the trash. I pretended not to notice. The most painful moments were never dramatic. They were small, tiny cuts, one after another. One afternoon, Vanessa invited me shopping. I thought perhaps we were finally becoming closer. As we walked through a department store, she held up a navy blouse. "This would look nice on you." I smiled. "It is pretty." Then she added quietly, "You really should update your wardrobe. People make assumptions." I looked down at my clothes. Simple slacks, comfortable shoes, the same pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. "What kind of assumptions?" I asked. She hesitated. "You know, that you don't take care of yourself." I laughed softly. At 67, I wasn't trying to impress anyone, but something inside me hurt. Because I had spent my entire life taking care of everyone else. I had cared for my husband during chemotherapy. I had worked extra jobs to help Ethan through college. I had stayed awake during illnesses, attended every school concert, saved every dollar, sacrificed vacations, postponed dreams. And now, according to my daughter-in-law, I didn't take care of myself because I wore sensible shoes. Ethan noticed none of it, or perhaps he chose not to. One evening after dinner, I finally spoke to him privately. We stood on the back patio while Vanessa cleaned the kitchen inside. "Ethan," I said carefully, "sometimes I feel that Vanessa doesn't like me." He sighed immediately. "Mom, I may be wrong." "No, you're overthinking." I looked at him. "Do you honestly think so?" He rubbed his forehead. "Vanessa is different from you. She grew up differently. She doesn't mean to offend you." "But she does." "Mom, please don't make me choose sides." That sentence stayed with me, because I had never asked him to choose. I had only asked him to see me. As months passed, family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable. Vanessa often interrupted me when I spoke. If I shared a memory, she changed the subject. If I offered advice, she smiled politely and ignored it. One Thanksgiving, I arrived early to help cook. Vanessa handed me a bowl of green beans. "Could you just wash these?" I nodded. Later, while guests arrived, I attempted to help set the table. "Oh, no," Vanessa said quickly. "I've already planned everything." I stepped aside. For most of the evening, I sat alone. People discussed investments, vacations in Europe, private schools, and business opportunities. I listened quietly. I had nothing to contribute, or at least that was how they made me feel. At one point, one of Vanessa's friends asked me what I had done before retirement. "I was a school secretary," I answered. The woman smiled politely. "That must have been nice." "Nice?" As though 35 years of work could be summarized in one small word, Vanessa added. Daniela's life has always been very simple. Everyone nodded. Simple. That word appeared often. Simple clothes, simple home, simple life. The truth was far more complicated, but I had spent years bearing my past. Perhaps that was my mistake. People only know the stories we allow them to hear, and I had stopped telling mine long ago. Christmas that year was especially painful. Ethan and Vanessa hosted a large dinner. Her parents attended. Several neighbors came. The house looked beautiful. Garlands decorated the staircase. A massive tree stood beside the fireplace. Everything sparkled. I brought handmade ornaments that Ethan had created as a child. Little wooden stars, painted snowmen, construction paper angels. I thought Vanessa might enjoy placing them on the tree. She looked at the box. "Oh, those are sweet." She set them aside. The tree remained covered in expensive decorations. None of Ethan's childhood ornaments appeared. After dinner, I found them still sitting in the box. Something broke inside me then. Not because of the ornaments, because of what they represented. Memories, history, family. The parts of Ethan's life that existed before Vanessa. The parts that seemed increasingly unwanted. A few weeks later, I called Ethan. "Would you like to come over for dinner this weekend?" There was silence. Then he said, "Vanessa already made plans." I swallowed my disappointment. "Maybe next weekend. We'll see." We'll see. 3 words that usually mean no. That evening, I sat alone in my living room. The grandfather clock ticked softly. Snow fell outside. Robert's photograph sat on the shelf. Sometimes I still spoke to him. I know that may sound foolish, but grief changes people. "Things are different," I whispered. I imagined what he would say. Robert always knew how to make me feel safe. He would probably tell me not to take everything personally. He would tell me Ethan loved me. But even love can become quiet. And quiet love sometimes feels very similar to absence. A month later, Vanessa hosted a brunch for several women from her social circle. She invited me. I thought perhaps things were improving. Instead, I spent 2 hours listening to conversations about luxury vacations and expensive renovations. At one point, one woman asked where I lived. I told her. Vanessa laughed softly. "It's such a tiny little house." The woman smiled. "Oh, are you planning to move?" Before I could answer, Vanessa said, "Daniela doesn't really need much." The women nodded. I sat quietly. No one asked what I needed. No one asked what I wanted. For the first time in my life, I began feeling invisible. Not because I was old, not because I was widowed, but because someone had decided that my worth could be measured by money, appearance, and status. And the hardest part was watching my son slowly accept that measurement. Vanessa had started rearranging more than furniture. She was rearranging Ethan's memories, his priorities, his loyalties. And little by little, she was moving me further away from the center of my own family. I still loved them. I still hoped things would change. But deep inside, I could feel something dangerous growing. Not anger, not resentment, loneliness. And loneliness, when it stays long enough, begins to convince you that perhaps everyone else is right. Perhaps you really are nobody. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Vanessa had designed it herself. Cream-colored cardstock, elegant gold lettering, a professionally printed envelope. At the top, it read, "Celebrating 5 wonderful years together. Vanessa and Ethan Perry." Beneath it was the date, the location, and a list of guests. Business owners, attorneys, investors, community leaders. I recognized almost none of the names. At the very bottom, written in Vanessa's neat handwriting, was a short note. Daniela, please arrive an hour early. I smiled when I read it. For the first time in months, I thought perhaps Vanessa wanted my help. Perhaps she was finally beginning to see me differently. Perhaps families simply needed time. That Saturday, I woke early. I baked lemon bars because Ethan loved them. I prepared a small container of my homemade chicken salad. I ironed my favorite blue dress. It wasn't expensive. I had purchased it nearly 8 years earlier during a department store sale. But it fit comfortably, and Robert had once told me the color made my eyes look younger. At my age, certain compliments stay with you forever. I curled my hair, applied a little lipstick, put on my pearl earrings. Before leaving, I stood in front of Robert's photograph. Wish me luck, I whispered. The drive to Ethan and Vanessa's house took almost 40 minutes. The neighborhood looked beautiful. Large homes, perfect lawns, luxury cars parked along the streets. When I arrived, several delivery trucks were unloading flowers and catering supplies. Vanessa opened the door. She wore a cream-colored dress and looked absolutely flawless. Oh, good you're early. I brought lemon bars. She glanced at the container. Oh, that's nice. She stepped aside. Inside the house barely looked familiar. Professional decorations covered every room. Fresh flowers stood on nearly every table. White candles lined the staircase. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Several hired servers moved through the kitchen. I suddenly felt as though I had entered someone else's world. What can I do? I asked. Vanessa hesitated. Actually, everything is pretty much finished. I stood awkwardly. I could help set tables. No, the planner already handled that. I could arrange flowers. We hired someone. I nodded. Oh. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at my dress. Her eyes moved slowly from my shoes to my necklace. Something in her expression changed. Daniela, she said carefully, can I make a suggestion? Of course. She smiled. Tonight is going to be fairly formal. I looked down. This is my nicest dress. I know. She paused. It's just that some of Ethan's clients are coming. I felt my stomach tighten. What are you saying? She crossed her arms. Maybe you could stay in the family room for most of the evening? I stared at her. I'm sorry. She sighed. Please don't misunderstand. I'm trying not to. The people coming tonight are very important. I felt heat rising in my face. And sometimes first impressions matter. The room became very quiet. Even the music seemed distant. I looked directly at her. Are you embarrassed by me? She immediately shook her head. No, of course not. Then why should I stay in another room? She looked uncomfortable. You're making this sound worse than it is. Am I? Before she answered, the front door opened. 2 caterers entered carrying trays. Vanessa lowered her voice. I just want tonight to go smoothly. I stood there for several seconds. Part of me wanted to leave immediately. Part of me wanted to cry. Instead, I smiled. I understand. She seemed relieved. Thank you. But I didn't understand. Not really. I spent the next hour sitting alone in the breakfast room while workers prepared the dining area. Occasionally, Vanessa passed by carrying decorations. She barely looked at me. Around 6 o'clock, guests began arriving. Expensive coats, designer dresses, perfect smiles. I recognized Ethan's laugh somewhere near the front door. I heard music, glasses clinking, conversations. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. At one point, Ethan entered the room. Mom. He kissed my cheek. You look nice. Thank you. He looked nervous. Everything okay? I studied his face. Had Vanessa spoken to him? Did he know fine? I answered. He nodded quickly. Good. Then he left. Only later would I realize that he already knew exactly where I had been asked to sit. About an hour later, I walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water. As I approached the hallway, I heard voices. Vanessa, and one of her friends. I stopped. Not intentionally, but my name caught my attention. I just worry about appearances, Vanessa said. Her friend laughed softly. She's Ethan's mother. I know. She seems sweet. Vanessa sighed. She is. There was a pause, then her friend asked quietly. What's the problem? Vanessa answered. The words would stay with me forever. She doesn't understand this world. Another pause. Honestly, she spent her entire life accomplishing nothing. She's basically nobody, and sometimes I worry people judge Ethan because of it. Nobody. The word echoed inside me. Nobody. I felt my hand shaking against the wall. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. 35 years working, raising a son, caring for a dying husband, building a family, loving people, sacrificing, surviving. And somehow, in her eyes, I had become nobody. Her friend said quietly, That's harsh. Vanessa lowered her voice. You know what I mean. No, I don't. I've worked hard to build a certain life. The friend asked, Do you think Ethan feels that way? Vanessa didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice became softer. He doesn't say it, but I think he understands. Those words hurt even more, because suddenly, I wasn't only losing my daughter-in-law, I was losing my son. I stepped backward before they could see me. I returned to the breakfast room. I sat down, and for the first time in years, tears filled my eyes. I wiped them away quickly. At 67 years old, you become very good at crying quietly. Nearly 30 minutes later, Ethan came looking for me. Mom, everyone's about to sit down. I stood slowly. As we walked toward the dining room, I noticed a distinguished older gentleman near the fireplace. Silver hair, dark suit, kind eyes. He appeared to be around 75. As I passed him, he suddenly looked directly at me. His expression changed. He frowned slightly, studied my face, then looked again, as though he recognized me, or perhaps remembered someone. He took a step forward. Excuse me, he said. I stopped. The entire room seemed strangely quiet. The man looked at me carefully. I apologize if this sounds unusual. I smiled politely. That's all right. He hesitated. Then he asked, Did you ever live in Savannah, Georgia? My heart stopped. Because no one had asked me that question in over 40 years. And suddenly, for the first time in decades, the past began knocking at my door. For several seconds, I couldn't answer the older gentleman. The sounds of the dinner party faded around me. The laughter, the music, the conversations. Everything suddenly seemed very far away. He looked at me carefully. I apologize, he said. You simply remind me of someone I knew many years ago. I swallowed. Yes, I finally answered. I lived in Savannah a long time ago. His eyes widened. My goodness, Before he could say anything else, Vanessa appeared beside us. "Charles, your seat is ready." The man continued looking at me. "You said your name is Daniela Perry." "Yes." He hesitated. "Was your maiden name Whitmore?" My heart nearly stopped. Nobody had spoken that name aloud in over 40 years. Not after I moved, not after I married Robert, not after I buried my parents, not after I decided to leave my old life behind forever. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Vanessa looked confused. "You know each other?" Charles smiled slightly. "I'm not certain." I forced myself to answer. "Yes, it was Whitmore." His expression changed completely. "My God!" The room suddenly felt smaller. Vanessa laughed politely. "Should I know what this means?" Charles looked at me before answering. I quickly shook my head. "Not now. Please, not now." He understood. "I may simply be mistaken," he said quietly. Vanessa seemed disappointed that the moment had ended. She guided him toward the dining room. I remained standing beside the fireplace. My hands trembled. The name Whitmore echoed inside my mind. A name I had buried. A name I had abandoned. A name that belonged to another woman, or at least that was what I had told myself. Dinner began shortly afterward. Vanessa had arranged place cards for every guest. I noticed immediately that my seat sat at the far end of the table. Not beside Ethan, not beside Vanessa, not even near people my own age. I sat beside two younger couples discussing real estate investments. Neither asked me a single question. Throughout dinner, Vanessa moved gracefully around the table. She laughed. She told stories. She introduced people. She looked like the perfect hostess. No one would have guessed that only an hour earlier she had called me nobody. Halfway through the meal, one of Ethan's business associates complimented the house. Vanessa smiled proudly. "We've worked very hard for everything we have." Ethan nodded. "We've been fortunate." Someone asked whether their parents had helped them purchase the house. Vanessa laughed. "My parents certainly gave us advice." Then she added, "Ethan and I have mostly built our own lives." She turned toward me. "Right, Daniela." I looked at her. She was smiling. But I understood the message. She wanted everyone to know that I had contributed nothing, that I came from nothing, that I represented nothing. "Yes," I said quietly. "We built our lives differently." She smiled and returned to her conversation. Several minutes later, one of the women at the table asked me what I had done before retirement. "I worked in education." "Oh, were you a teacher?" "No, I was a school secretary." The woman smiled politely. "That must have been rewarding." "It was." Vanessa laughed softly. "Daniela was always very practical." Again that word, practical, simple, ordinary. Safe descriptions for a woman nobody wished to know. Charles Bennett sat several seats away. Throughout dinner, I noticed him watching me, not rudely, not suspiciously, simply watching, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle. After dessert, guests moved into the living room. Soft music played. Coffee was served. People gathered into small groups. I stood near one of the windows looking outside. The neighborhood lights glowed softly. Snow had begun falling. Charles approached me carrying 2 cups of coffee. "May I?" I nodded. He handed me one. "You are definitely Daniela Whitmore." I looked down at the cup. "I haven't used that name in over 40 years. "I met your father twice." The room seemed to tilt. "My father, Thomas Whitmore." Hearing my father's name felt almost painful. He had died many years earlier, but suddenly I could see him clearly, tall, confident, always wearing a suit, always expecting excellence. Charles smiled gently. I was a young banker in Savannah. You knew him? Everyone knew him. I closed my eyes briefly. Not everyone. Not anymore. Vanessa approached again. She seemed increasingly curious. What are you two talking about? Charles looked at me. I answered quickly. Old memories. Vanessa smiled politely. Well, Charles used to live in Georgia. I know, he said, and apparently so did your mother-in-law. She looked surprised. I had no idea. Many years ago. Vanessa laughed. Daniela never talks about herself. That was true. I didn't. Because some memories are too heavy. Some doors remain closed for a reason. Charles asked quietly, Have you ever returned? No. Not once. I shook my head. There's nothing left there. He studied me. I'm not sure that's true. Before I could answer, Ethan joined us. Everything okay? Charles smiled. I was just discovering that your mother and I share some old connections. Ethan looked surprised. Mom lived in Georgia. I nodded. When I was young. You never told me. His words hurt. Not because he accused me, because he sounded almost like a stranger. You never told me. As if there had been opportunities. As if he had ever asked. Vanessa looked at me carefully. For the first time that evening, I saw genuine curiosity in her eyes, perhaps even confusion. Because the woman she thought she knew was suddenly becoming unfamiliar. Charles said quietly, Your mother comes from a remarkable family. I immediately interrupted. That was a very long time ago. Vanessa frowned. What family? No one important? Charles looked surprised, but he respected my answer. Eventually the conversation changed, yet I could feel Vanessa watching me for the rest of the evening. The questions had begun. Who was I? Why had I lived in Savannah? Why did Charles recognize me? Why had I never spoken about it? Around 10 o'clock, guests began leaving. Charles approached me near the front door. He handed me his business card. If you ever wish to talk. I accepted it. Thank you. He lowered his voice. Your father was one of the finest men I ever met. I felt tears threaten again. He would be disappointed to hear that. Charles shook his head. No. He looked directly into my eyes. He would be proud. After he left, I gathered my purse. Vanessa stood near the staircase. Daniela. Yes? She hesitated. You never mentioned Georgia. I never thought it mattered. She folded her arms. Charles acted as if your family was important. I smiled slightly. Not anymore. What was your father's business? I looked toward the front door, toward the falling snow, toward the darkness outside. He was simply my father. She seemed frustrated. Why won't you tell me? I looked at her for a long moment. Because the truth was that I had spent decades trying to become someone else, trying to forget, trying to leave that world behind. And because part of me wondered whether Vanessa cared about me now, or only about who I had once been. I think it's late, I said quietly. Ethan offered to drive me home. I declined. As I walked toward my car, I noticed Charles standing beside his vehicle. He raised his hand slightly. I did the same. On the drive home, memories began returning. Savannah, the house, my father, the old photographs, the things I had packed away long ago. For decades, those memories had remained hidden in a small wooden box inside my attic. I had not opened it in years. I had convinced myself it no longer mattered. But as I pulled into my driveway that night, one thought entered my mind. Perhaps the past was not finished with me, and perhaps very soon, neither was my daughter-in-law. I did not sleep that night. After returning home from Ethan and Vanessa's anniversary party, I sat alone in my kitchen with the lights turned off. The clock above the stove showed nearly midnight. Outside, snow covered the front yard. Inside, only the small lamp near the sink remained lit. Charles Bennett's business card sat on the table beside my coffee cup. His words kept repeating in my mind. Your father would be proud. For years, I had convinced myself that my past no longer mattered. I had buried it carefully, like a box placed in the attic and forgotten. But once someone opens an old door, memories begin walking through it. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, I climbed the attic stairs. I had not been up there in nearly 6 years. Dust covered the shelves. Old Christmas decorations sat beside Robert's fishing equipment. Several boxes contained Ethan's childhood toys. Near the back wall stood a small cedar chest. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside lay another box, smaller, dark blue. The leather corners had begun to crack. When I lifted the lid, 40 years disappeared. Photographs, letters, programs from charity events, newspaper clippings. My father's fountain pen. A silver bracelet my mother had worn. At the very top rested a photograph of a young woman standing beneath enormous oak trees. For a moment, I did not recognize her. Then I realized I was looking at myself. 23 years old, long dark hair, white summer dress, a smile untouched by grief. I sat on the attic floor and began remembering. I was born in Savannah, Georgia. Back then, my name was Daniela Whitmore. My father, Thomas Whitmore, owned several shipping businesses along the coast. My grandfather, Benjamin Whitmore, had built the family's success decades earlier. The Whitmore name carried influence. People recognized it. Businesses respected it. Charities sought it. As a child, I never understood what that meant. I simply knew that our house was large. Our dining table was always full. And my mother believed proper manners could solve nearly any problem. The Whitmore house stood beneath enormous live oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The ceilings were high. The hallways seemed endless. Every Christmas musicians played in our living room. Every spring my mother hosted charity events, politicians, business leaders, judges, doctors. They all passed through our home. Yet despite all that wealth, my father remained remarkably kind. He often said something I never forgot. Money only reveals character. It doesn't create it. He treated employees respectfully. He donated quietly. He helped families without expecting recognition. Many evenings he would take me driving through Savannah. He taught me that dignity mattered more than status. I was his only child, and because of that, many people assumed I would someday inherit everything. But life rarely follows expectations. When I was 24, I met Robert Perry. He was nothing like the men my family expected me to marry. He came from Ohio. He worked as a mechanic. He drove an old pickup truck. His father had worked in a factory. His mother was a nurse. Robert possessed no wealth, no social connections, no impressive family history. What he had was kindness. He listened. He laughed easily. He made people feel safe. For the first time in my life, someone loved me for who I was rather than what my name represented. My parents disagreed, especially my father. Not because he disliked Robert, but because he feared I would regret leaving the life I had known. One evening, he invited me into his study. He stood beside the window for a long time. If you marry him, your life will change. I know. You may lose things. I understand. He looked directly at me. Do you love him? Yes. He smiled sadly. Then the decision is already made. Many people assume wealthy families create dramatic conflicts. Mine did not. My father never disowned me. He never raised his voice. He simply warned me that life would become harder. He was right. Robert and I married quietly. 2 years later, we moved to Ohio. I left Savannah. I left the Whitmore estate. I left the expectations. I left nearly everything. At first, I wrote home often. My mother sent letters. My father called occasionally. But distance changes relationships. Then life became busy. Robert worked. I found a job at a school. Ethan was born. Money became tight. Years passed. My mother died unexpectedly. My father suffered a stroke several years later. I returned to Savannah for his funeral. That was the last time I saw the Whitmore house. After his death, most of the estate passed into trusts and charitable foundations. Some relatives sold portions of the property. Other sections became museums and historical sites. I never fought for anything. People have often asked why. The answer is simple. By then, my real life existed elsewhere. My husband, my son, my home, my family. I did receive some inheritance, but much of it went toward medical bills, helping others, and creating small educational funds my father had always wanted to establish. Over time, I stopped speaking about Savannah. I stopped using Whitmore. I became simply Daniela Perry, wife, mother, secretary, neighbor, volunteer, and eventually, widow. As dawn approached, I continued looking through the photographs. There were pictures of my parents, pictures of large gatherings, pictures beside people whose names still appeared in newspapers. But none of those things mattered to me anymore. Or so I had believed. One particular photograph caught my attention. My father stood beside several businessmen during a fundraising event. One of the men looked familiar. I moved the photograph closer. Suddenly, I recognized the face. Older now, but unmistakable. Richard Collins, Vanessa's father. Much younger, standing beside my father. I stared at the image. How was that possible? I searched further. Another photograph. Another event. Again, Richard appeared. Then I found a newspaper clipping discussing a local business crisis many years earlier. Several families had received financial assistance through one of my father's foundations. One name caught my attention. Collins. My heart began beating faster. Could it be the same family? Had Vanessa's family known mine? Had they known my father? I sat there as morning sunlight entered the attic. For decades, I had avoided the past. Now, it seemed the past had quietly been sitting inside my own home all along. The following afternoon, my phone rang. It was Ethan. Mom. Hello. He sounded hesitant. Vanessa has been asking questions. I remained silent. About Georgia? I see. He paused. Is there something we should know? I looked at the photographs scattered around me, the faces, the memories, the life I had left behind. I don't know, I answered honestly. For the first time in many years, I truly didn't know. Because somewhere between the woman I used to be and the woman I had become, an old story had started waking up. And very soon, everyone around me would discover that the quiet widow they called nobody had once lived an entirely different life. 3 days passed after the anniversary party. 3 quiet, uncomfortable days. Ethan called twice, asking questions he did not know how to ask. Vanessa sent one text message. I hope you're feeling okay. I did not answer immediately. Not because I was angry, because I did not yet understand what had changed. For 3 years, Vanessa had shown almost no interest in my past. She knew where I lived. She knew where I worked. She knew I had been widowed. That was enough for her. Now suddenly, she wanted answers. And I could not stop wondering whether she wanted to know Daniela Perry or Daniela Whitmore. On Thursday morning, Ethan called again. Mom, good morning? He hesitated. Vanessa wants to do something. I waited. Her parents are coming next weekend. So, she's creating a family heritage display. I frowned. A what? Pictures, family history, old photographs. That sounded exactly like Vanessa. She loved presentation. Beautiful tables, perfect decorations, stories that impressed people. He continued. She's asking everyone to bring photographs. I looked toward the attic stairs. The old box, the forgotten pictures, the past. You don't have to bring anything, Ethan said. The words hurt more than he realized. Why would he assume I had nothing? Why did everyone assume I came from nowhere? I'll see what I have. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my kitchen. The box remained upstairs. Part of me wanted to leave it there forever. For decades, those photographs had belonged only to me. Robert had seen them. Very few others had. Even Ethan had never looked through them. When he was younger, I had planned to tell him. Then life became busy. College, marriage, careers, responsibilities. Eventually, the moment disappeared. By Saturday afternoon, I still had not decided. I carried the box downstairs, placed it on my dining room table, opened it again. Photographs covered the surface. The Whitmore house, my parents, garden parties, charity events, business dinners, my wedding to Robert, young Ethan, old newspaper clippings, letters. The more I looked, the more confused I became. What exactly would these photographs accomplish? Would they change anything? Would they make Vanessa respect me? And if they did, what would that say about her? I almost put everything away. Almost. Then I remembered her voice. She's basically nobody. Perhaps the photographs were not about proving my worth. Perhaps they were simply part of my story. And stories deserve to be remembered. The following Sunday, I drove to Ethan and Vanessa's house carrying the small blue box. The weather had become warmer. Spring was beginning to arrive. When I entered, I found the dining room covered with family albums. Vanessa's parents had brought several large leather books. Margaret Collins displayed wedding photographs. Richard had old military pictures. Even Ethan had brought childhood photographs I had forgotten existed. Vanessa stood beside a large table. She had purchased elegant frames, decorative labels, small cards. Everything looked professionally organized. She smiled when she saw me. For the first time in months, her smile appeared nervous. Daniela. Hello? She looked at the box in my hands. Oh. I nodded. I found a few things. Her eyes moved toward the small box. That was all. No excitement, no curiosity, just polite acknowledgement. She turned toward another guest. I quietly placed the box on the corner of the table. Nobody opened it. Nobody asked. For nearly an hour, everyone shared family stories. Margaret described her grandparents. Richard talked about military service. Vanessa proudly displayed photographs of expensive vacations and family celebrations. Ethan showed pictures from his childhood. There was one photograph of him fishing with Robert. Another showed him riding his bicycle. Several guests smiled. Then Vanessa picked up one of the old photographs. "Look how young Ethan was." Everyone laughed. I sat quietly. My box remained closed. Eventually, Margaret noticed it. "Daniela, are those your photographs?" I smiled. "Some old ones." Vanessa glanced toward the box. "You don't have to go through them if they're personal." Again the assumption, as though there could not possibly be anything important inside, as though my history would only waste everyone's time. Richard spoke kindly. "We'd love to see them." I hesitated. Suddenly I felt exposed. Those photographs belonged to another lifetime, another woman, a woman no one in this room knew. Vanessa looked at her watch. "We still need to finish the display." She wasn't being cruel, not openly, but I understood. My photographs could wait. Everyone else's stories mattered first. I quietly slid the box closer to me. "Maybe another time." Ethan barely looked up. "Whatever you want, Mom. Whatever you want." Again, the distance between us. Around 2 o'clock, several people moved into the kitchen. Margaret began helping prepare lunch. Richard stepped outside. Ethan answered a work call. Vanessa remained near the dining room table organizing photographs. I stood. "I think I'll head home." Vanessa looked surprised. "So early?" "I'm tired." She nodded. As I reached for the box, Vanessa suddenly spoke. "Wait." I turned. "Could I at least see one?" Her voice sounded different, less confident. Perhaps Charles Bennett's questions still troubled her. Perhaps curiosity had finally won. I looked down at the box. My hands rested on the worn leather lid. 40 years. 40 years of silence. 40 years of avoiding questions. 40 years of pretending the past no longer existed. Slowly, I opened it. Vanessa stepped closer. Inside rested dozens of black and white photographs, letters tied with ribbon, old programs, newspaper clippings. Her expression changed slightly. She reached for the first photograph. A large house beneath enormous oak trees. She frowned. "What house is this?" "My childhood home." She looked surprised. Another photograph. A formal dinner. Men in tuxedos. Women in gowns. Vanessa studied it carefully. "Who are these people?" "My parents." Her eyebrows rose. She pulled out another picture. A young woman standing beside several civic leaders. That woman was me. She looked at my younger face, then at me, then back again. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa seemed completely uncertain. The room had grown quiet. Margaret had returned. Richard stood near the doorway. Even Ethan had finished his phone call. Nobody spoke. Vanessa continued sorting through the photographs. Then suddenly, she froze. Her hand stopped. The color drained from her face. She stared at one particular picture. A picture of my father standing beside several businessmen. One of them was a much younger Richard Collins, and standing beside him was Vanessa's grandfather. Her voice barely came out. "Why is my grandfather in your photograph?" No one answered, because in that moment, everyone in the room realized the woman they thought they knew had been hiding an entire lifetime. And the small blue box sitting on the table was about to change everything. No one moved. Vanessa continued staring at the photograph as if it had suddenly become something dangerous. Her fingers trembled slightly. She looked from the picture to her father, then back to me. Richard Collins slowly walked toward the table. "Let me see that." Vanessa handed him the photograph. For several seconds, he said nothing. The room had become completely silent. Margaret stood beside him, her expression growing increasingly confused. Ethan looked at me. "Mom." I lowered my eyes. Richard carefully adjusted his glasses. "My goodness." He looked at me again. "Daniela, where did you get this?" I answered quietly. "It belonged to my father." He looked back at the picture. In the photograph, my father stood beside several businessmen during a fundraising banquet in Savannah nearly 45 years earlier. One of those men was Richard's father, William Collins. Another was my father, Thomas Whitmore. The image had been taken long before I met Robert, long before Ethan was born, long before I became Daniela Perry. Vanessa finally spoke. "Dad," Richard swallowed. "I've seen this photograph before." The room grew even quieter. Margaret stepped closer. "What are you talking about?" Richard looked at me. "Your father was Thomas Whitmore." I nodded. Vanessa frowned. "Who is Thomas Whitmore?" Nobody answered immediately, because to some people the name meant nothing. To others it meant a great deal. Richard finally spoke. "The Whitmore family helped a lot of people in Savannah." Vanessa looked confused. "I don't understand." Richard sat down slowly. His face had become pale. "My father knew them." I remained silent. Part of me wanted to close the box and leave. Part of me wanted to disappear. For decades, I had hidden these memories because I never wanted them to define me. Now they sat openly on Vanessa's dining room table. Ethan pulled out a chair. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at my son. The question hurt. Not because he asked it, because I had once wanted to tell him many times. "When would I have told you?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth sat between us. Years had passed. Conversations had disappeared. Life had become schedules and holidays and polite phone calls. Margaret picked up another photograph. It showed my mother standing beside several women at a charity event. The old Whitmore estate appeared behind them. "Oh my goodness!" Vanessa looked over her shoulder. "Was that your house?" "Yes." She stared at me. "The big house?" "When I was young." She seemed unable to understand, because the woman sitting quietly at her dining table did not match the images before her. The modest widow, the retired secretary, the woman she had called nobody, and the young woman standing beside influential people in expensive gowns. Those two women did not fit together in Vanessa's mind. She picked up another photograph. This one showed me at 22 years old. I wore a white dress. My father stood beside me. Several community leaders stood behind us. Vanessa looked carefully. "That's you?" "Yes." She studied my face. For the first time in 3 years, she truly looked at me. Not my clothes, not my house, not my age. Me. Richard continued sorting through the photographs. Suddenly, he stopped. He found an old newspaper clipping. His hands began shaking. Margaret noticed. "What is it?" He handed her the article. She read the headline, "The Collins Shipyard Recovery Fund." Her eyes widened. Vanessa frowned. "What does that mean?" Richard looked at me. Very quietly, he said, "My father's company nearly collapsed in the early 80s. I said nothing. He continued. "A private family foundation helped save it." Vanessa looked confused. "What foundation?" He looked down at the newspaper. "The Whitmore Foundation." Silence. The room seemed frozen. Ethan stared at me. Margaret slowly sat down. Vanessa looked from one person to another. "No?" Richard nodded. "Yes." "But that's impossible." He placed the clipping on the table. My father spoke about them many times. I suddenly remembered those years. My father had established several funds before his death. Some businesses, some schools, some families. He believed people deserved second chances. I had never followed where the money went. I never asked. Vanessa shook her head. So you're saying, Richard interrupted, our family received help. Nobody spoke. The clock in the kitchen ticked softly. Outside, birds sang, normal sounds, yet everything inside the room had changed. Vanessa looked at me. Her voice became very small. You knew, I answered honestly. No, she frowned. You didn't know my family? I knew the name Collins. That's all. Yes. Richard spoke quietly. My father often said we survived because someone showed us kindness. He looked at me. I never realized it was your family. Margaret sat beside him. I remember hearing the Whitmore name years ago. Vanessa looked at her mother. You knew. Only stories. Vanessa seemed overwhelmed, because the entire foundation of what she believed had suddenly shifted. For years, she had judged me, measured me, dismissed me, and now every assumption had begun collapsing. She picked up another photograph. This one showed my father shaking hands with local leaders. Charles Bennett appeared in the background as a much younger man. Vanessa recognized him immediately. Charles knew. I nodded. He recognized my father's name. She looked directly at me. Why didn't you tell us? The question came again. Why didn't you tell us? I looked around the room. At Ethan, at Vanessa, at the photographs, at 40 years of silence. Because I stopped being Daniela Whitmore a long time ago. Nobody answered. I continued. I became Robert's wife. My son's mother. A secretary? A widow. I didn't think the rest mattered. Vanessa whispered, It matters. I looked at her. Why? She couldn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. It mattered now. After the photographs, after the names, after the connections, after the wealth. But where had that interest been before? Where had those questions been when I sat alone at holidays? When my food was ignored, when my clothes were mocked, when I was asked to stay in another room? Tears appeared in Vanessa's eyes. I didn't know. No. I nodded gently. You didn't. Richard stood and approached me. Daniela, I owe your family more than I can explain. You owe me nothing. But my father helped people because he believed it was right. He lowered his head. Across the room, Ethan still looked stunned. Mom, why did you give it all up? I smiled sadly. I fell in love. He said nothing, because perhaps for the first time in his life, he realized his mother had once been young, once had dreams, once had difficult choices, once had sacrificed things he never knew existed. Vanessa carefully returned the photographs to the box. Her hands moved slowly now, respectfully, as though touching something fragile or sacred. Finally, she looked at me. Her voice shook. I'm sorry if I ever... I raised my hand gently. Not yet, because apologies are easy when people discover value. Character is harder. The afternoon sunlight entered the room. The old photographs lay scattered across the table, pieces of a life nobody had bothered to ask about. And as I looked at Vanessa's pale face, I realized something important. She had spent 3 years believing I was nobody. But the real shock wasn't that I had once been someone important. The real shock was discovering that the woman she had dismissed had always been worthy of respect, even before she saw the photographs. Nobody left for almost 2 hours. The photographs remained spread across Vanessa's dining table. Sunlight slowly shifted across the room, touching faces that had become strangely quiet. For years, I had been the least interesting person in that house. Suddenly, everyone wanted answers, but I discovered something uncomfortable. The attention I had once lacked now felt almost as painful as the neglect, because people were no longer looking at Daniela Perry. They were looking at the woman they had never bothered to know. Ethan sat beside me. His voice was gentle. "Mom, please tell us." I looked at my son. At 40 years old, he suddenly looked very young again. The same boy who once climbed into my bed during thunderstorms. The same child who had held my hand at his father's funeral. For years, I had protected him from burdens he never knew existed. Perhaps I had protected him too well. I folded my hands. "My name used to be Daniela Whitmore." Nobody spoke. "I was born in Savannah." "I grew up there." "My father was Thomas Whitmore." Vanessa listened carefully. Richard and Margaret sat quietly. Even the ticking kitchen clock seemed louder. "My family had money." The sentence felt strange. I had not spoken those words aloud in decades. "We owned businesses, property, foundations." Vanessa finally asked the question that had been sitting inside her. "How much money?" I smiled sadly. "Enough that people knew our name." She looked stunned. "But then why? Why did I become a school secretary?" She nodded. "Why live in a small house? Why work? Why struggle?" I looked toward the window. Because the answer was simple. I fell in love. I told them about Robert, the mechanic from Ohio, the man with rough hands, the man who owned almost nothing, the man who taught me that peace matters more than wealth. Ethan listened silently. He had heard stories about his father all his life, but never this part. "My father warned me life would become difficult." "Was he angry?" Vanessa asked. "No." "Disappointed?" "Perhaps." I smiled. "But he loved me." I explained how Robert and I moved to Ohio, how we started with almost nothing. Our first apartment, our old furniture, the years of counting every dollar, the joy of Ethan's birth, the ordinary life I had chosen. Margaret finally spoke. "You gave everything up." I thought about that question. Did I had lost wealth, status, influence, but I had gained Robert. I had gained Ethan. I had gained a real life. "No," I answered softly. "I chose something else." Vanessa stared at the photographs. Her eyes kept returning to the old mansion, the formal dinners, the elegant clothing, the young woman smiling beside important people. Perhaps she was trying to understand how someone could walk away from all of it. Richard slowly picked up the newspaper clipping again. His voice shook slightly. "My father talked about the Whitmore Foundation." I looked at him. "He said someone saved our company." I frowned. I didn't know. "He never forgot it," he swallowed. "We would have lost everything." Margaret nodded. "Richard's father almost went bankrupt." Vanessa looked confused. "You never told me that." Richard smiled sadly. "Families don't always tell their children everything." That sentence struck me because I had done exactly the same thing. For years, I had hidden my past, not because I was ashamed, because I wanted Ethan to build his own identity. I never wanted him to feel that he lived in someone else's shadow. I wanted him to succeed because of who he was, not because of my father, not because of the Whitmore name. Perhaps that decision had been right. Perhaps it had been wrong. Vanessa finally looked directly at me. So, your family helped mine. My father helped many families. But ours too. Apparently. She lowered her eyes. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain. Not elegant. Not confident. Simply uncertain. And beneath that uncertainty, I began seeing something else. Shame. Richard stood and walked toward me. I owe your family everything. You owe me nothing. But if your father had not stepped in, my father believed helping people was the right thing to do. He nodded. I wish my father were alive to know this. I understood. There are some debts that can never be repaid. Only honored. Vanessa suddenly asked a question I had not expected. Did Ethan inherit anything? The room became quiet again. I answered honestly, no. She looked surprised. You never gave him money. I helped him through college. No trust fund. No. No family money. I shook my head. Whatever remained after my parents' deaths had either gone toward charitable work, medical expenses, my father's wishes, or the life Robert and I built. I had never believed money was the greatest inheritance. Vanessa seemed confused. Why? I looked at her. Because character matters more. Her eyes filled slightly, perhaps because those words carried more meaning now. Ethan finally spoke. Mom, were you ever going to tell me? I thought for several seconds. Maybe someday? When? When you wanted to know me. The sentence came out before I could stop it. Silence followed. Ethan lowered his head, because both of us understood the truth. Years had passed without real conversations. He knew my medical appointments, my address, my birthday. But he no longer knew my heart. He no longer knew my stories. And perhaps I no longer knew his. Vanessa quietly returned several photographs to the box. She handled them carefully now, almost respectfully. Finally, she spoke. I called you nobody. No one moved. Her voice trembled. I said horrible things. I looked at her. She had, but not because she knew my past, because she believed my present lacked value. She continued. I thought... Her voice failed. What? She wiped her eyes. I thought you had never done anything important. I smiled gently. I was Ethan's mother. Tears appeared in Ethan's eyes. I was Robert's wife. I looked toward the photographs. I worked 35 years helping children. I cared for my husband until he died. I paid bills. I made dinners. I loved my family. I met her eyes. That was important. No one spoke, because suddenly the photographs themselves seemed less important. The mansion, the money, the old family name. Those things explained my history, but they did not explain my worth. Vanessa began crying quietly. I judged you. Yes. I thought you were less than us. I nodded. You did. Richard sat heavily in his chair. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. The room felt different now. Not because secrets had been revealed, because illusions had been broken. Vanessa had believed value came from appearance. Money, education, neighborhoods, status. And now she sat face to face with a woman she had underestimated for 3 years. A woman who had never once used her family name, never once mentioned wealth, never once tried to impress anyone. Ethan finally reached for my hand. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Mom." I looked at my son. Not yet, because apologies require understanding, and understanding had only just begun. As evening approached, I carefully placed the photographs back into the blue box. The old images, the old names, the old life. 40 years of silence had ended. But another truth remained. The greatest thing my father ever gave me was not money. It was the ability to walk away from it. And perhaps for the first time, my son and his wife were beginning to understand that the richest woman sitting in that room had been the one they believed was poor. The following week felt strangely quiet. No one seemed to know how to behave anymore. For 3 years, my role inside the family had been simple. I was Ethan's mother, the widow, the retired school secretary, the woman with the small house. Now every conversation carried questions nobody knew how to ask. Vanessa called twice. I did not answer, not because I wanted to punish her, because I needed time. For decades, I had lived comfortably without my old identity. Now it had suddenly entered every room, every conversation, every silence. On Wednesday afternoon, Margaret Collins called. I almost let the phone ring, but something told me to answer. "Daniela?" "Hello, Margaret." Her voice sounded softer than usual. "Could we talk?" I hesitated. "About what?" "About our families." There was a long pause. "I think there are things Vanessa needs to understand." We agreed to meet at a small cafe halfway between our homes. When I arrived, Margaret was already sitting near the window. She looked tired. For years, I had viewed her as part of Vanessa's world. Elegant, confident, perfect. But that afternoon, she simply looked like a mother worried about her daughter. She smiled gently. "Thank you for coming." I sat down. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she folded her hands. "I owe you an apology." "You don't." "I do." I looked at her carefully. She continued. "I recognized your name years ago." My heart skipped. "What?" She nodded. "When Ethan and Vanessa became engaged, I heard your full name." I frowned. "But Perry isn't unusual." "No." She hesitated. "But Daniela is." I waited. "My father once mentioned a Daniela Whitmore who left Savannah for Ohio." I sat quietly. She lowered her eyes. "I didn't know for certain." "Why didn't you ask?" Margaret sighed. "Because I wasn't sure." "And later," she looked ashamed. "Later I thought it wasn't my place." For several seconds, we both remained silent. The waitress brought coffee. Neither of us touched it. Margaret finally spoke again. "My father admired your family." I said nothing. "He used to tell us that the Whitmores saved many people." She smiled sadly. "He especially admired your father." I looked out the window. Cars passed. People hurried down the sidewalk. Ordinary life continued while old stories returned. Margaret took a deep breath. There is something Vanessa doesn't know. I looked back at her. What? My father worked for Richard's father. I frowned. The Collins shipping company nearly collapsed. I remembered the newspaper clipping. She nodded. We lost almost everything. Her eyes became distant. I was 14. She smiled sadly. I remember hearing adults whispering. About money? About bankruptcy? About losing our house? I listened quietly. Then she said something unexpected. My father cried. I looked at her. I had never seen him cry before. She swallowed. A few months later, everything changed. I understood. The foundation? She nodded. My father always said one family stepped in. One family gave him time. One family believed he deserved another chance. She looked directly at me. That family was yours. I lowered my eyes. For a moment, I saw my father again. Thomas Whitmore, standing in his office, signing papers, helping strangers, never expecting gratitude. Margaret reached into her purse. She removed an old envelope. I found this. The paper had yellowed with age. She carefully handed it to me. My hands began trembling before I even opened it. The signature at the bottom stopped my breath. Thomas Whitmore. My father. The letter was addressed to William Collins. I read quietly. Business failures do not define a man. Character does. Please accept this assistance without shame and use it to rebuild your future. My eyes filled with tears. I had not seen my father's handwriting in years. Margaret's voice became emotional. My father kept this his entire life. Why? Because he said your father saved his dignity. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret said the words I never expected. I failed Vanessa. I looked up. What do you mean? I taught her to pursue success. She smiled sadly. I forgot to teach her humility. I thought about Vanessa, her expensive clothes, her perfect home, her constant need to impress others. Perhaps that behavior had not appeared suddenly. Perhaps it had grown slowly. Margaret continued. I saw the way she treated you. I looked surprised. You knew? She nodded. Not all of it. Enough. Why didn't you say something? She lowered her eyes. The answer came quietly. Because sometimes mothers fail too. The words stayed between us. We both understood. I had failed Ethan in certain ways. She had failed Vanessa. Love does not make parents perfect. Margaret finally asked, Will you talk to Vanessa? I looked out the window again. I don't know. She feels terrible. She should. Margaret nodded. Yes. There was no defense, no excuses, only truth. She then said something that surprised me. Vanessa grew up hearing stories about successful people. People with money. People with influence. She became afraid of being ordinary. I thought about that, afraid of being ordinary. Perhaps that explained many things. The expensive parties, the perfect appearances, the endless comparisons, the fear of judgment. Margaret's eyes became moist. She spent her whole life trying to prove she mattered. I answered quietly. And she decided other people mattered less. Margaret nodded. Yes. We sat quietly. Then she asked the question nobody had yet asked. Why did you never tell Ethan? I looked at my father's letter. Because the answer had become clearer. I wanted him to become his own man. But he didn't know you. I smiled sadly. No. She reached across the table. You gave your son freedom. Perhaps, or perhaps I had given him distance. As we prepared to leave, Margaret stopped me. There is something else. What? She smiled softly. My father told me once that your father made everyone promise never to speak publicly about his donations. That sounded exactly like him. He believed gratitude belonged to God, not newspapers. I laughed quietly. That was Thomas Whitmore. Margaret looked at me carefully. No. She shook her head. That was your father. For some reason, those words hurt, because suddenly I missed him terribly. The drive home felt long. When I entered my house, I placed the old letter beside Robert's photograph. Two men, very different. Both had shaped my life. That evening, my phone rang. Vanessa. I stared at the screen. For several seconds, I considered answering. Instead, I let it ring. A voicemail arrived. Her voice sounded broken. Daniela, I know you probably don't want to talk to me. She paused. I spoke to my mother. Another silence. I didn't know. Her voice cracked. But I think that's the problem. I listened carefully. I never wanted to know. Tears filled my eyes, because finally someone had spoken the truth. Not ignorance, not misunderstanding, choice. She continued, I judged you before I knew you. I decided who you were, and I was wrong. I sat quietly in my living room after the message ended. The house felt very still. Robert's photograph sat nearby. My father's letter rested beside it. The past and present seemed to share the same room. And for the first time, I realized something important. The old photographs had not revealed who I was. They had only revealed who everyone else had chosen to believe I was. And now, my daughter-in-law was finally beginning to see the difference. The following Sunday, Vanessa came to my house, alone. I saw her car pull into the driveway shortly after noon. For several moments, I remained standing in the kitchen watching through the window. She sat inside the car without moving. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her head lowered. She looked nothing like the woman who had once organized perfect parties and controlled every conversation. She looked frightened. Eventually, she walked to the front door. When I opened it, neither of us spoke. Hello, Daniela. Hello. She held a small paper bag in her hands. I brought muffins. I almost smiled. For years I had brought food to her house. Now she stood at my door carrying baked goods. Life has a strange sense of balance. Come in. She entered quietly. Her eyes moved through my living room. The old furniture, the photographs, the books, the worn rug. She had seen these things before, but now she looked differently. Not at objects, at evidence. Evidence that a life had been lived here. I made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, I practiced this speech several times. I waited. But now I don't know what to say. I sat across from her. You can start with the truth. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. I was cruel. I said nothing. I judged you. Yes. I made assumptions. Yes. She looked down. I thought you were less important than other people. The honesty surprised me. Most apologies avoid the truth. Vanessa walked directly toward it. She wiped her eyes. I cared too much about appearances. The kitchen became quiet. The old clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed softly. Outside, birds sang, ordinary sounds surrounding extraordinary conversations. She looked at me. When I first met you, I saw your house. I nodded. I saw your clothes. She swallowed. I saw that you didn't travel. That you weren't wealthy. That you worked as a secretary. Her voice shook. And I decided who you were. I took a slow breath. Yes. She looked directly into my eyes. The photographs changed everything. I studied her face. This was the moment that mattered, not the apology, the truth beneath it. I asked quietly, "Would you be sitting here if you had never seen those photographs?" Her face collapsed. Tears fell immediately because she knew the answer. No. The word barely came out. She covered her eyes. No. I let the silence remain because honesty deserves space. She continued, and that's what I hate about myself. I listened. I wish I could say I would have changed anyway. But I don't know. She looked at me. I only started asking questions after I thought you had been important. Her shoulders shook. And that's horrible. For the first time, I felt genuine sympathy, not because she was suffering, because she finally saw herself clearly. Vanessa had spent her entire life measuring people, education, money, neighborhoods, careers, appearances. And now she had discovered that her own measurements were broken. She whispered, "I called you nobody." Yes. I told people you accomplished nothing. Yes. Her tears continued. But you gave up everything. I shook my head gently. No. She looked confused. You left wealth. Yeah. You left your family estate. Yes. You worked your entire life. Yes. Why? I smiled softly. Because I loved my husband. She stared at me. And that was enough. I looked around my kitchen. The old cabinets, the faded curtains, Robert's photograph nearby. Most days, yes. Vanessa became quiet. After several minutes, she asked, "Were you ever unhappy?" I thought carefully. Sometimes. Because of money? No. Because of leaving Savannah? No. I looked directly at her. Because I became invisible. She lowered her eyes, and I knew she understood. I continued. After Robert died, people stopped asking about me. Ethan became busy. You became busy. Everyone assumed older women have no stories left. My voice softened. But we do. Vanessa cried quietly. I'm sorry. This time I believed her. Not because of her tears, because she had finally understood the wound. She looked around the room again. Your house feels warm. I smiled slightly. You used to think it was small. It is small, I laughed. Yes. She smiled through tears. But it feels loved. That sentence mattered because for the first time she saw value that could not be purchased. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about Robert, about Savannah, about Ethan as a child, about my father, about mistakes, about marriage. Eventually, Vanessa asked something unexpected. Were you ever afraid of becoming ordinary? The question surprised me. Then I realized she wasn't asking about me. She was asking about herself. I answered honestly. When I was young, yes. What changed? Robert. She listened carefully. He taught me that ordinary lives can be extraordinary. She looked down. I've spent my entire life trying to impress people. I nodded. I know. My father worked very hard. My mother wanted me to succeed. I became terrified of failing. She smiled sadly. And then I started measuring everyone. Her voice became very quiet. Especially you. For years, I had seen only arrogance. Now I saw fear. Fear of losing status. Fear of judgment. Fear of becoming insignificant. Perhaps Vanessa had been fighting her own loneliness all along. She finally asked, "Can you forgive me?" I looked at her for a long time. Forgiveness is not a single moment. It is many moments. It is honesty, responsibility, change, trust. I don't know yet. She nodded. I understand. But I believe you regret it. Her eyes filled again. I do. As the afternoon ended, she stood near the front door. Before leaving, she reached into her purse. She removed a folded piece of paper. "What is this?" I asked. She handed it to me. It was the seating chart from the anniversary dinner. I looked carefully. My name sat at a small table near the back. Far from the guests. Far from Ethan. Far from everyone. She began crying again. I wanted to hide you. The words were almost unbearable. I know. She shook her head. I was ashamed. I folded the paper. Then I placed it back into her hands. Keep it. She looked confused. Why? So you never forget who you became. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She nodded. I won't. Before leaving, she hesitated. Then she asked, "May I hug you?" For several seconds, I didn't answer. Because this moment mattered. Not the photographs, not the Whitmore name, not the money. This. A woman who once saw me as nobody standing in my doorway asking permission to hold me. Slowly, I opened my arms. She cried against my shoulder. And although forgiveness had not fully arrived, something else had. Understanding. As I watched her drive away, I realized the old photographs had done exactly what my father would have wanted. Not reveal wealth, not reveal status, reveal character. And for the first time since entering my family, my daughter-in-law had finally begun becoming the woman she was capable of being. Summer arrived quietly. The heavy conversations began to fade. The tears became less frequent. Life slowly returned to normal. Or perhaps it became something new. For the first time in years, Ethan started calling every week. Sometimes he asked about recipes. Sometimes about Robert. Sometimes about Savannah. One Sunday afternoon, he sat beside me on my back porch. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. Birds moved through the trees. For several minutes, we simply watched the sunlight. Finally, he said, "I missed a lot." I smiled softly. "Yes." He looked ashamed. I thought adulthood meant moving forward. "And now, I think it means remembering who walked beside you." His words touched me, because my son was finally becoming the man Robert had hoped he would become. Vanessa changed too, not suddenly. Real change rarely happens quickly. She began visiting without invitations. She brought groceries. She asked questions. She listened. One afternoon, she sat with me for nearly 3 hours looking through the old photographs. Not because of the Whitmore name, not because of the estate, but because she wanted to know me. "Tell me about your mother." So I did. "Tell me about Robert." I told her. "What was Ethan like when he was little?" I laughed. For years, nobody had asked these questions. Now they filled the room, and something inside me slowly healed. One Saturday, Vanessa surprised me. "I want to show you something." She drove me to Ethan's house. As we entered, I immediately noticed changes. The expensive decorative pieces were still there. The elegant furniture remained. But something else had appeared. Photographs, real photographs. Ethan as a child, Robert holding a fishing pole, our old family Christmas, pictures from our small house. Memories. Above the fireplace stood a framed photograph of Robert. I stopped walking. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Vanessa stood beside me. "I hope this is okay." I looked at the photograph. Robert was smiling, the same smile that had carried me through difficult years. "You put him here." She nodded. "Ethan wanted him here." My eyes filled with tears, because for years Robert had slowly disappeared from their home. His stories, his memory, his presence. Now he had returned. Ethan walked into the room. "We should have done it years ago." I nodded. Yes. That evening we had dinner together. Simple food, simple conversation. No performances, no guests, no expectations. At one point, Vanessa disappeared upstairs. When she returned, she carried something in her hands, the old seating chart, the one from the anniversary party. The paper looked worn now. She placed it on the table. I kept it. I looked at her. "You told me to." She nodded. "I read it sometimes." "Why?" She swallowed. "Because I never want to become that person again." No one spoke. The paper sat between us, a reminder, a confession, a lesson. Ethan reached for Vanessa's hand. For the first time, I saw something different between them. Not perfection, not image, partnership. Several weeks later, I received an unexpected letter. The return address said Savannah, Georgia. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note from Charles Bennett. "Dear Daniela, I recently visited the old Whitmore property. The foundation plans to restore part of the gardens next year. Several members of the Historical Society asked whether you might someday visit. No pressure, no expectations. But I thought your father would want you to know that people still speak his name with respect." I read the letter twice. Savannah, 40 years. The city I had left. The city I had avoided. The city where my parents were buried. That evening I showed the letter to Ethan. He looked surprised. "Would you go?" "I don't know." Vanessa sat quietly. Then she said, "I think your father would want you to." I looked at her. "My father." She smiled gently. "Both of them." For several days, I thought about the letter. I walked through my house. I looked at old photographs. I visited Robert's grave. One afternoon, sitting beside his headstone, I spoke aloud. "I don't know if I should go." The cemetery remained quiet. Wind moved through the trees. I remembered our first apartment, our first Christmas, the years of struggle, the nights we counted coins, the mornings we laughed anyway. Robert had never once made me regret leaving Savannah. Not once. And suddenly I understood something. Returning did not mean abandoning the life we built. It meant honoring all of it, the woman I had been, the woman I became. the woman I am now. 2 weeks later, I invited Ethan and Vanessa for dinner. After dessert, I looked at both of them. "I've made a decision," Ethan smiled. "About Savannah," I nodded. "I want to go." Vanessa looked surprised. "When?" "This fall." There was a brief silence. Then Ethan asked quietly, "Would you like company?" The question touched me deeply, because years earlier he would never have asked. I smiled. "Yes." Vanessa looked uncertain. "Me too." I studied her, the woman who once hid me from guests, the woman who called me nobody, the woman sitting before me now. "Yes." Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Really? Really?" Because forgiveness had quietly entered the room. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Ethan smiled. "We'll go together." For the first time in decades, the idea of returning to Savannah no longer frightened me. The old photographs had opened doors, the truth had opened hearts, and perhaps the next journey was not backward. Perhaps it was forward. That night, after they left, I sat beside Robert's photograph. The house felt peaceful. Outside, summer insects sang. The old clock ticked softly. For years, I believed the story was about wealth, about family history, about forgotten names. But now I understood. The story had never been about the Whitmore family. It had never been about money. It had never been about old photographs. It was about visibility, about being seen, about allowing people to know us. And perhaps for the first time in many years, my family finally saw me. Not Daniela Whitmore, not Thomas Whitmore's daughter, not the woman from Savannah. Simply Daniela Perry. And somehow, that felt like the greatest honor of all. October arrived with cool air and golden leaves. For the first time in more than 40 years, I returned to Savannah. The four of us traveled together. Ethan drove. Vanessa sat beside him. I sat in the back seat beside the small blue box of photographs. Inside that box rested nearly half my life. The drive felt strangely quiet, not uncomfortable, peaceful. Occasionally, Ethan asked questions. "What was your school like? Did Grandpa fish? What was the house like?" And for hours, I answered. Vanessa listened carefully. Sometimes she wrote things in a notebook. Finally, I asked, "What are you writing?" She smiled. "Your stories." No one had ever done that before. After nearly 2 days on the road, we reached Savannah. The moment we entered the city, my heart began racing. The old trees, the Spanish moss, the historic streets, the warm air. Some places remain inside us no matter how many years pass. I had left Savannah as a young woman. I returned as a widow, a mother, a grandmother someday perhaps, a woman who had lived an entire life elsewhere. Ethan looked around. "It's beautiful." I smiled softly. It always was. The Whitmore estate stood outside the city. Time had changed it. The property was smaller. Part of the land had become public gardens. Another section belonged to the Historical Society. The house itself had been restored. As we walked toward the entrance, my legs felt weak. A woman from the Preservation Committee greeted us. "Mrs. Perry?" I nodded. "Welcome home." The words nearly broke me. Home. I had not called this place home in decades. Inside, everything felt familiar and strange at the same time. The staircase, the fireplace, the library, the gardens visible through large windows. Some furniture remained, some paintings, photographs, memories. Ethan walked slowly through the rooms. This is where you grew up? Yes. Vanessa stood quietly beside me. She no longer looked impressed. She looked emotional. That difference mattered. The director of the Historical Society showed us several exhibits. One room displayed information about local charities. Another discussed the Whitmore Foundation. There, hanging on the wall, was a photograph of my father, Thomas Whitmore, his familiar smile, his calm eyes. I had not expected the pain. Tears filled my eyes immediately. Ethan placed his hand on my shoulder. Mom, I haven't seen this picture in years. Vanessa read the plaque beside it. It described my father's community work, his scholarships, his business assistance programs, his donations. She looked at me. He sounds like you. I smiled through tears. No. I looked at my father's photograph. I hope I'm a little like him. Later that afternoon, we visited the cemetery. My parents rested beside one another beneath large oak trees. I had not stood there since my father's funeral. 40 years. 40 years of distance. 40 years of silence. I knelt beside the graves. Ethan stood nearby. Vanessa remained several steps behind. For a long time, nobody spoke. Finally, I whispered, I'm sorry it took me so long. Wind moved softly through the trees. Some apologies belong to the living. Others belong to the dead. As we returned toward the car, Vanessa stopped. She looked toward my parents' graves. Then she looked at me. May I say something? I nodded. She walked closer to the headstones. Her voice shook. I never met you. She looked down. But your daughter became the kindest person I've ever known. Tears filled my eyes. She continued. And I didn't appreciate her. Silence. I judged her. She wiped her eyes. But she loved me anyway. The cemetery remained quiet. No one moved, and for the first time, I felt something settle inside me. Not forgiveness. That had already begun. Something deeper. Peace. That evening, we stayed at a small inn near the historic district. After dinner, Ethan asked, Mom, do you wish you'd stayed here? The question surprised me. I thought carefully. I looked at my son, at Vanessa, at the years behind us. No, not even a little. I smiled. No. Vanessa looked surprised. Why? I thought about Robert, our tiny apartment, our first car, the hospital room, the years of struggle, the years of love, because those things had made my life. Because if I had stayed here, I wouldn't have had Robert. I looked at Ethan, and I wouldn't have had you. My son's eyes filled with tears. He looked down. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Ethan said, I'm glad you chose us. I reached for his hand. I always would. The next morning, before leaving Savannah, we visited the gardens one final time. The old oak trees still stood. Sunlight filtered through the branches. Vanessa walked beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, When I first met you, I thought you had nothing. I looked at her. I know. She smiled sadly. But you had everything. I asked softly, What do you mean? She looked toward the trees. You had love. You had memories. You had dignity. You had family. She wiped her eyes. And I was so busy chasing success that I couldn't see it. I placed my hand over hers. Now you can. She nodded. Yes. Several months later, life settled into something new. Ethan called every week. Vanessa visited often. Sometimes we cooked together. Sometimes we looked through old photographs. Sometimes we simply sat and talked. The picture of Robert remained above their fireplace. The small blue box stayed in my living room. Not hidden, not forgotten. One evening, Vanessa gave me a gift. It was a framed photograph. Not the Whitmore estate. Not my father. Not Savannah. It showed 4 people standing beneath an old oak tree. Me, Ethan, Vanessa, and Robert's photograph held in my hands. At the bottom, she had written, "Family is not who impresses us. Family is who sees us." I cried when I read it, because that was the true story all along. Not money, not status, not old photographs. The photographs only opened the door. What mattered was what entered afterward. Humility, truth, forgiveness, love. Today, the old blue dress still hangs in my closet. The same dress Vanessa once found embarrassing. The same dress I wore the night she called me nobody. I have never thrown it away, because it reminds me of something important. People may overlook us. They may misunderstand us. They may measure our worth by things that do not matter. But our value does not change because someone fails to see it. My father taught me dignity. My husband taught me love. My son taught me forgiveness. And my daughter-in-law taught me something unexpected. Sometimes people must lose their illusions before they can finally see the truth. And the greatest inheritance I ever received was not the Whitmore name. It was the ability to leave it behind. Because in the end, I was never Thomas Whitmore's daughter. I was never the girl from Savannah. I was never the woman in the photographs. I was simply Daniela Perry. And finally, my family learned to see her. Life has a way of hiding the most important stories. Sometimes the quiet woman at the end of the table has sacrificed more than anyone else in the room. Sometimes the person living in the smallest house carries the richest memories. And sometimes the people we overlook are the very people who helped build the lives we enjoy. This story is not really about wealth, family names, or old photographs. It is about dignity. Daniela spent years being judged because of her age, her home, her work, and her appearance. Yet none of those things defined her value. The world often teaches us to admire success, money, status, and influence. But true worth is found in kindness, sacrifice, loyalty, and love. Vanessa's greatest mistake was not failing to recognize the Whitmore name. Her mistake was failing to recognize the humanity sitting in front of her. Many parents quietly give up dreams, opportunities, comfort, and security for their children. They do so without expecting applause. Their sacrifices often become invisible because love itself is quiet. This story reminds us to ask questions. Listen to our parents, learn their stories, respect the elderly, and never assume that a simple life is an empty life. The greatest inheritance we leave behind is not money. It is character. It is compassion. It is the people we help. It is the love we give. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Have you ever discovered that someone close to you had a story you never knew? Please tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city tonight. Your story may help someone else feel less alone. And if these stories speak to your heart, please like, subscribe, and join this community where every voice matters and every story deserves to be heard.